our survey on the law, and we're going into that here this evening. There are many different things that we will look at. What we are going to look at this evening has to do with primarily the civil statutes that God set in motion. The principles of the civil statutes ultimately are based upon the spiritual law that is God's spiritual law of love that is summed up in the Ten Commandments. But as we began this Bible study series, we saw that there are certain things that have been changed in terms of the New Testament application. We saw that the laws, we're told in Hebrews, that the laws relating to the meat offerings, the drink offerings, the various washings and physical rituals. In other words, the ceremonial laws. We saw that there's been an alteration and a change in those, that they were added to last until the time of Christ, and that we do not follow those ceremonial laws in that way today. We also saw that there has been a change of the law of the priesthood. That is spelled out in detail in Hebrews. And that our priest today is Jesus Christ. And so the laws pertaining to the priesthood, and they're specifically tithing, reflect that change, that we tithe not to the priesthood of Aaron, but to the priesthood of Melchizedek. In other words, the New Testament ministry of Jesus Christ. We also saw that there was another change, and that had to do with the administration of debt. The civil penalties that were given in ancient Israel, that were exacted for a letter of the law of disobedience, that we today administer the Spirit, and not simply the letter of the law, that it is not an administration of the death penalty. Many of the civil statutes apply on a national level, and we will notice that as we go through. In many cases, there are individual and personal applications, or at least principles, that we can apply in our personal lives. Many of these civil statutes will be again applied and administered in the world tomorrow, when God's government is being exercised over all the earth, because many of them relate in a very much of a national way. We can apply the principle, and should apply the principle, but it is not the exact letter is not always necessary. We're going to look, and there will be a certain amount of overlap. What I'm going to do, we covered physical laws last time. We're covering civil statutes this time. We're going to cover ceremonial laws, and then we're going to focus in on the spiritual principles of the law, and that will probably take us a couple of Bible studies to do that. So we will find that there is always a little bit of overlap, because ultimately underlying the principles of all of God's instructions gets back to the very character and nature of God, which is love. And the Bible tells us how to relate to God, and how to relate to our neighbor, and how to relate to the creation around us. Many of the physical laws had to do primarily with our relationship with the physical realm in which we live. But even the civil statutes focus in on our relationship with our neighbor. And that, of course, is based upon God's spiritual law. But the underlying principle of the civil statutes is God's spiritual law, and yet there are some very specific national applications. We find that there are civil laws that relate to the various categories of the poor, the strangers, the fatherless, the widows, the blind, the deaf, the enemy. There are civil laws and statutes that relate to that, general principles of categories of neighbors. There are civil laws that relate to servants. There are, in addition to that, there are civil laws that relate to government, dealing with the information about the role of judges and priests, cities of refuge, various penalties for different types of crimes. There are laws relating to warfare. So we find that there are also civil statutes relating to property and to taxation, to matters of inheritance that again had to do with some of that. So I have a chart that I will pass out to you probably next Bible study, which is biblical law in topical order, and it just goes down adultery, agriculture, animals, kindness to, atonement, bestiality, blasphemy, blessings, obedience, blind, blood, child rearing, cities of refuge, clean and unclean clothing, corners of the field. It just goes right down through topics of all sorts of laws, and it gives you the chapter and verse reference of everywhere that topic is referred. So I think that will be a good basis of a general Bible study that will sort of be a good place to go. So let's in going through here, to begin with, let's go back to the original judgments that God gave in Exodus chapter 22, 21, 22, 23. What we find is in Exodus 21, these are the judgments. These are civil judgments and statutes, which were set before them here. The starting point of these had to do with the relationship of servants and the regulation of servitude. Now, what we find is that servitude was allowed. Now, you notice the key word in Exodus 21, the key word through these judgments is if. It's predicated on the fact that people do things they shouldn't necessarily do. And if somebody has done this, what do you do about it? And if somebody did that, what do you do about that? So here was Moses, at God's instruction, having to deal with situations that involve people who did not really obey the spirit of the law. We're told, in terms of servitude, that if you buy a Hebrew servant, he serves 6 years, and in the 7th he will go out free for nothing. And if he has come in by himself, he will go out by himself. If he were married, when he came in, his wife would go out with him. Now, let me call your attention here. This, of course, the principle of release, the 6 years of servitude, and the 7th year that the Hebrew servant would be released. If he was married when he became a servant, then he would his wife went out with him. If he was not married, then we find that the wife didn't go out. Now, let me make comment on that, because in verse 4 it says that if his master has given him a wife, then the wife and the children are there. Now, if you put that together with verse 2, verse 4 and verse 2 are put together, what is found right here is that the wife mentioned in verse 4 was not an Israelite, was a Gentile. Because if it involved a Hebrew servant, then they would have gone out in the 7th year. So what you have is the problem had to do with someone who was a servant and who wound up, while they were in servitude, marrying a Gentile servant who would not have been released in the seventh year. And of course, the basic point of the law, you knew this when you went into it. This would serve to greatly discourage this sort of marriage, which was not a good marriage. God didn't want His people intermarrying with these other people. You know, somebody was a servant. 7 years might seem like a long time to be single. Well, he couldn't. He wasn't going to find some of the other women in the community who were interested in marrying him. Here he was in servitude, and so he might have had a temptation to have married one of the Gentile servants that belonged there to his master, and seemingly that would have solved his problem. Well, God didn't want His people all intermarrying with all these other groups and having, over a period of time, the nation would lose its ethnic identity. So He put what at first glance appears to be a pretty harsh prohibition here, but the point of it was to discourage this sort of thing from ever taking place. Because if you knew that your choice was that you either had to give up your identity as an Israelite and remain there in servitude, or you had to leave behind a family, it would really discourage you from ever having entered into a marriage like that to begin with, because everybody knew the rules up front. It's not like they got into these situations and the rules were made afterward. They knew the rules up front. And something like this would have greatly served to have discouraged a person from getting into a marriage that would have, over a period of time, what it would do is bring in all these mixed children into the nation and into the general population stock of the nation. Over a period of time, over a period of generations, that would have some real it would change the nature of the nation. And so some of these regulations, as we will see, may appear to be pretty harsh, but God was dealing with carnal people who really did not have a spirit of obedience, and there were long-term complicating factors that would impact a nation, would impact the nation for generations to come, even just in a physical way. And so there were prohibitions that were made. And of course, the servant could renounce his rights as an Israelite, and this is brought out in verses 5 and 6. Interestingly enough, the only example of a man wearing an earring is right here in verse 6. It was a sign of perpetual servitude. It was a sign that you had renounced your heritage as an Israelite and had become a perpetual slave. So that's that is the significance of that. The chapter 21, verse 7, refers to a daughter coming, translated maidservant in the King James. The Jewish commentary, the Sonsino, brings out not a bondswoman, but with a view to marriage with the master or his son. This was the sense of it. It was there were customs in terms of dowry and the bride gift. You remember back in Genesis when Abraham sent his servant to obtain a wife for Isaac, that he sent a goodly sum of money and gifts to the family to be given to them if Rebekah would agree to accompany him. Well, this is what is referenced to here, and it has to do with someone with a woman, if the master of the household or the son were going to put her away. He could not sell her into a strange nation. He's dealt deceitfully with her. He has to treat her like a daughter. And it doesn't say in verse 10 that he should take another wife, but it says if he does, that her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he's not prepared to do that, then she's free to leave, and he will have to pay her a sizable sum of money to be set by the judges. Things like that serve to discourage people from following some of the customs of the time. That the realization that if they were to take another wife, that there were rights that were possessed by even by the woman here, that he could wind up having to pay a very sizable property settlement if he did not meet these requirements. Verse 12, he that smites a man so that he shall die shall surely be put to death. And then it describes the difference between accidental homicide or involuntary manslaughter or premeditated murder. There was a city of refuge that we will read about in a few minutes. If it was an accident, if it was something that just happened, there was a city of refuge to which he could flee. If it was premeditated murder, in verse 14, there was the death penalty. Someone who attacked his parents, that was a capital crime. It was a capital crime to assault your parents, to attack them, to kidnap. Verse 16 was a capital crime. He that steals a man and sells him, or if he be found in his hand, doesn't matter. He shall surely be put to death. And verse 17, not only was it a capital crime to assault your parents in that way, verse 15, to attack them, but he that curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Now, that was a very serious matter. The fifth commandment is you're to honor your parents, and the whole integrity of the nation from a civil standpoint is based on the fact that there is a respect is a vital factor. When respect breaks down in a society, the whole society unravels. And then there are penalties coming on down verses 18 and 19 that involves two people fighting, and one is badly hurt. Then it involves their fines to be paid. Perhaps even medical costs, as it mentions in verse 18 and 19. It talks about, in verse 20, this is a man smiting his servant. Servitude was allowed in ancient Israel, but there were laws regulating it. You couldn't just beat one of them up and hurt them or kill them. You were to be punished, or the literal Hebrew is, he shall surely be avenged. And if it involved, it was a serious matter. We find here that in verse 21, it involves a situation that was not premeditated. It was a matter of someone was injured and time went by. It wasn't realized to be as serious as it was. The verse 22 talks about, some have misread verse 22 here of Exodus 21 and sought to somehow connect it with abortion. It has no connection with abortion whatsoever. It has to do with two men fighting and a woman who gets in the way and is injured. Number one, if two men are fighting, you don't get down there in the middle of it because you're probably going to get hurt. That's the starting point for that. And if she is hurt, then there's a fine that's to be paid. There's damage. There's a fine that's to be paid. It's not treated. If she gets there and she is injured, she might lose the child. Well, the loss of the child is a purely accidental matter that comes out of something like that. Just a fall or a shove or something like that. The individual who caused the injury is fine. It's not treated as premeditated murder because it wasn't. He wasn't setting out to try and murder the unborn child within her. It was a matter that she had brought part of the problem on herself by getting down there in the middle of a fight. And the principle is given in verse 24. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, let's look a little bit at what that is talking about, because that has sometimes been misapplied. It's not a matter that somebody's eye was getting gouged out every time. It is saying that the punishment is to that the punishment is to fit the crime. And there were some cases where if somebody intentionally did a certain damage to his neighbor, that he had the same thing done to him, which would sort of make you think twice before you went and did something to your neighbor if you knew the punishment was going to be. Today what do? Well, they may get a little fine, or they're liable to sue you, or no telling what. It's just crazy situation. If you knew that some of these things, it makes the same point in Deuteronomy 19:21. Your eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. The principle of the law was that the punishment was to fit the crime. And it wasn't to be a matter that, regardless of who was involved. You see, it wasn't that if you hurt a rich man, you had a great harsh penalty. If you hurt a poor man, you didn't have much penalty at all. It was a matter that the penalty was to suit the crime. And if you it is not talking again about this is regulating premeditated harm or damage that you do to someone. It's not talking about even necessarily an accidental injury, even in a scuffle. But it's talking that if you go out and you do harm to someone, that as he says in Leviticus 24:19, if a man cause a blemish in his neighbor, as he has done, so it shall be done to him. So in Leviticus 24, you see, we're told that verse 16, he that blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death, and the congregation shall stone him. Verse 17, he that kills any man will be put to death. He that kills a beast shall make it good, beast for beast. If he causes a blemish in his neighbor, as he has done, it'll be done to him. Verse 21, he that kills a beast restores it, and he that kills a man will be put to death. You have one manner of law as well for the stranger as for one of your own country. So there was a principle of fairness and equity that was to extend the cross. Now, as we come on down here in chapter 21 of Exodus, this had to do in verse 26, in 27, with a man who was a master, and he had a servant, and if he injured the servant by putting out an eye or knocking out a tooth, he had to grant them freedom. Now, the man that had a servant had a lot of money tied up in that servant. The law of God was, look, you don't abuse that fellow. He's your servant, and he's supposed to do what you tell him to do. You have control over him, but you don't abuse him. You don't mistreat him. If you do, you injure him, the penalty is you're going to have to turn him loose. Well, you go back and you can look a little bit at even in our country, the prices that were paid, you realize that when you're talking about the value of a servant, you're talking about a large sum of money, a very large sum of money. You've got that sort of money tied up in somebody, and you realize that if you abuse them, the law is going to make you give them freedom. You are going to be careful. And that was the point. God regulated servitude. We're going to see, the main reason that someone was a servant a bond servant was generally they had been sold in as a result of debt. They had been taken as a captive in war. There were various reasons why someone would have been a servant that way, but it was regulated. In verses 28 and on down through the remainder of the chapter, it has to do with an ox goring someone, and the fact that if an ox, or this certainly the principle would apply to any animal that killed someone that way, the animal was violent, and and it killed somebody, that the animal was put to death. If it was a clean animal, it wasn't eaten, it was put to death. It's a dangerous animal. You've got an ox that winds up killing somebody. That's not an animal you want that needs to be around. Verse 20, but the owner is not liable for damages. But if, verse 29, if it was known in the past that the ox was bad, he's injured some other people, hadn't killed anybody, but he's injured people in the past, he was known to do that, and the owner had not kept him up. You see, they had what we would term open range in most of the country. So it was that you don't want an animal running out on open range that is dangerous and violent, going to kill somebody. So here's an animal that if that happens, the animal is gotten rid of. The owner isn't liable unless it was known that this ox or this animal was bad. And if they know that he's kept, that the ox was known to gore, it was dangerous, and the owner hadn't kept him up and hadn't done anything, the owner could be actually put to death. Verse 29. He knew better than to let an animal like that run loose. It was a known fact that the animal had attacked people and had seriously injured people in the past, and he hadn't taken any action to put him up. And there was in some cases, a fine was attached that and it goes through and it gives all the specifics. If you dig an open pit in verse 33, and an animal falls in it, then you have to make it good. And in effect, you have to buy the animals. And two oxen, verse 35, one man's ox hurt another's, that he die, then they'll sell the live ox and divide the money of it. And the dead ox also shall they divide. But if it was known that the ox is used to push in times past and the owner's not kept him in, he'll pay ox for ox, and the dead will be his own. So, in some cases, if just two of them get in a fight and one of them is killed, then basically what they do is they just divide they just divide the price. They sell the live one and divide it up. They divide what's there. But if it was known, you say you've got something dangerous and you haven't kept it up. Chapter 22, it deals with theft. Somebody steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it. He's to restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If the thief be found breaking, he's found breaking up and he dies, he's smitten so that he die, there's no blood to be shed. If the sun be risen upon him, there'll blood be shed. He should have made full restitution. This is talking about somebody's breaking in, and it's night, you don't see what's going on, and the thief winds up being hit and dies as a result. There's no crime that's been committed. But if it's broad daylight and you see the fellow stealing and you execute vengeance on him by killing him, then that's murder. Because the penalty for theft is not a capital crime. It's restitution. So if he steals an animal, he has to restore 4 times over. If he's caught with the animal still in his hand, he restores double, because you get the one back you had, you see, and then he has to give you another one also to compensate you for your trouble. If he's killed or gotten rid of what you had, so you can't get the one back you had, then he's got to restore several times over, see, because you lost the one you had. Verse 5, if he cause a field or a vineyard to be eaten, it's a matter of turning your livestock loose in your neighbor's garden or something, restitution has to be made. If fire breaks out, the one kindled the fire has to make restitution, verse 6. So it's principles of liability, principles of responsibility. You cause a problem, you don't keep up your livestock and they damage your neighbor's property, set fire to stubble and let it get out and burn your neighbor's property, you have got to be liable for damages. All these are judgments, you see, that were civil penalties. Well, the principle of those things applies, that we ought to be responsible. So in some cases, in terms of crime and punishment, we're not executing vengeance, but certainly the principle is certainly applicable in our case, the principle of the law. If you got a dangerous animal, you keep him up, or you get rid of him. You don't let him run loose, whether it's an ox or a dog or whatever it is. If you got something dangerous, you don't endanger your neighbor by just letting it run loose. If you're going to burn off your field, you better make good and sure that you have got things under control and you don't let it get out and get on your neighbors. Now, some of these things, we have civil laws in our nation that exact many of these things. Of course, today, people have gone crazy with it. They'll sue you for all the mental anguish they had while the problem was going on, and they'll probably want $1 million for the mental anguish that caused them to see all of that. Well, some things get sort of ridiculous, but the principle is a principle of responsibility. Then it talks about verse 7, if a man delivers to his neighbor money or stuff to keep, and it's stolen, if the thief is found, he has to pay double. If the thief isn't found, then the man takes an oath that he didn't have anything to do with it. And verse 10, if a man delivers unto his neighbor something to keep, and it die or be hurt or be driven away, they take an oath between them that the one who was keeping it had nothing to do with the problem, and that's it. He doesn't have to make it good. What you find is, in verse 14, if a man borrows something from his neighbor and it's damaged, he has to make it good. If your neighbor asks you, look, I'm going to be out of town, I want you to keep this for me, you're doing it as a favor to him. And if something happens and it's damaged, your house catches on fire or a thief breaks in and steals it, you're not liable for it because you didn't initiate it. You're doing it as a favor to him. If, on the other hand, you ask to borrow it and something happens to it, then you're liable. So that is the distinction here between the two. If you borrow aught of your neighbor and it's damaged, verse 14, you are to make it good. Again, that principle comes down. It ought to apply to us. It's a principle of, it's a part of the civil statutes here. It's amazing. That seems like a very simple thing, but it's amazing how many times people will borrow something from somebody, tear it up, bring it back torn up, and say, I sure hated this. This thing tore up. You loaned me here. Broke. And they think that's the end of the story. Well, according to the law of God, you borrow something from somebody and you tear it up, you've got to fix it. You've got to replace it. That's simply, really, if you think about it, isn't that doing unto your neighbor as you'd like for him to do unto you? So one of the points of that is if you can't afford to fix it or to replace it, you probably better not borrow it. Because sometimes accidents happen. Things happen. If you are not going to be able to afford to make it good, then you probably better leave it alone. Now, in verse 16, it talks about young people. It talks about basically fornication, a young man who's marriageable and a young woman, and he entices her. This is sort of the origin of the shotgun wedding. He shall endow her to be his wife. And if her father utterly refused to give her unto him, then he had to pay a fine. He had to pay what amounted to the dowry. That he was, the principle was, look, you marry her. You can't simply misuse someone and go on your way. Death penalty for people who were involved in witchcraft and demonism, bestiality in verse 19, idolatry in verse 20. Verse 21, you shall neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. You don't take advantage of people who are of different nationality, different race. Don't vex them. Don't oppress them. Don't try to mistreat them in some way. You don't afflict the widow or the fatherless child. God says, if you afflict them in any wise, and they cry unto me, I'm going to hear it. And my wrath shall wax hot, and I'll kill you with a sword. That's a pretty strong promise. God says, you mistreat the widows and the fatherless, and you're going to have to answer to me. I tell you, anybody has any fear of God before their eyes, they better realize that you don't mistreat people, and the people that you certainly don't mistreat are the people who are defenseless. Now, that's human nature. People want to take advantage of someone that's not in as much of a position to defend themselves or to fight back. And God takes that very seriously. That was a very serious matter. Verse 25, if you lend money to any of your people that's poor, don't collect interest off of it. This is not talking about an investment or some sort of business arrangement. This is talking about somebody is hard up. He is borrowing money to pay his rent or to buy some groceries. God says, don't, if you're going to loan money to somebody who's in dire straits, you're not trying to make money off of him. That you can loan him something, and he'll pay you back, but don't be trying to take advantage of his situation. He says, you take your neighbor's raiment to pledge, you got to deliver it to him by the time the sun goes down. So that sort of discouraged you from taking his raiment in pledge, taking his, generally they wore a cloak. This is what he'd wrap up in at night, use it for a blanket. Told not to revile the judges or curse the ruler of your people, verse 28. We're to show respect. You're not to delay to offer the first of your ripe fruits and of your liquors. The first born of your sons belongs to God. With all the sheep and all of this. You're not to delay to pay God what's His. You're to be holy to God. Chapter 23, you're not to raise a false report. Put not in your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Not to follow a multitude to do evil. Neither shall you speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Don't follow the crowd. Don't follow a mob. Don't get tangled up with a bunch of people who are out looking for trouble. Just don't do that. You're to be fair. Don't countenance a poor man in his cause. See, you're not to favor somebody because they're rich or poor. You're to be fair and even-handed. If you meet your enemy's ox or his ass going astray, you bring it back. If you see an ox or an ass lying under a burden, then you help it up. Don't wrest judgment of the poor. Keep far from a false matter. Verse 7. Take no gift. The gift blinds the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. This is talking about, verse 24 is particularly addressed to a lot of this is addressed to the rulers. They're not to Well, what do we see so often happening with a lot of the politicians? They're taking gifts. These people are called lobbyists. They come and they offer them free trips to the Bahamas, and they offer them this and they offer them that. Of course, that these people, their judgment isn't swayed by any of that. It's ridiculous. God just said, look, don't do that. You don't oppress a stranger. Verse 9. 6 years you sow your land, gather the fruit. The 7th year it's to lie at rest, and it's to let it rest and lie still. The poor of your people may eat, and the beasts of the field can eat. So this is tied right in with the Sabbath that you observe, and all your servants are able to observe it. And verse 13, in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of your mouth. So, go around, using the names of all these various gods and goddesses and your oaths and things of that sort. That they just weren't to be involved in that. To observe God's festivals, describes that here, and then goes into the sacrificial, little bit of the sacrifice that was to be done, and how that they were to put out the Canaanites, and how God would send the hornets before them. So we find that various principles that are brought out here. If we go on back now to Leviticus 19, we pick up a few more statutes and judgments. So all based, Leviticus 19 2 tells us that we're to be holy because God is holy. The chapter 18 talks about, verse 4 of Leviticus talks about the statutes and the judgments. Verse 5, you keep my statutes and my judgments. And then it goes through detailing matters of incest and the fact that that is a wickedness, that is a capital crime. And all of the various things are spelled out. Adultery in verse 20. Verse 22 deals with homosexuality. You shall not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Neither shall you lie with any beast to defile yourself therewith. And he says, this is why I'm destroying the nations before you. These are the abominations, verse 27, that these people have done. Continuing on in chapter 19, where it goes through and it deals with a number of aspects. It talks about idolatry. It talks about in verse 9 of Leviticus 19, when you reap the harvest of your corners, don't wholly reap the corners of the field, neither gather the gleanings. You're not to glean the vineyard. This is left for the poor and the stranger. You see, you don't, you leave the corners of the field. So, this is a principle. Most of us are not in a situation of applying this in a literal fashion, because we don't live in a primarily agricultural society. Most of us are not involved in agriculture in that way. But you notice the principle of God's law was you make it possible for people to help themselves. If you own a field, you've got a field there. Don't just try to get every single thing out of it. You can leave a little bit for the poor and the strangers to come. But notice that it didn't say you gather it up and deliver it to them. They come and gather it. They've got to put forth some work and some effort too. You know, it wasn't a welfare state that God created. It's not talking about somebody who's sick or injured in a way that they can't, they're bedridden or something of that sort. It's talking about people who are maybe poor and somewhat destitute, but who are healthy. They can get out in the field. They can gather some of the produce. The principle that God gave in terms of the civil statutes of the nation was you make it possible for people to help themselves. Think how much better off we'd be as a nation if we had a system that was geared to that. rather than to the sort of welfare state that we have. The comes on down in verse 13, you're not to defraud your neighbor, don't rob him, the wages of him that's hired shall not abide with you all night to the morning. If you owe somebody something, you promised him wages, this is speaking of people who are hired by the day. Well, a lot of times, somebody who works that way, they need what they need, and they need it right away. Because they may go hungry this evening if they don't have, they don't get their, they don't get their wages. This is really a mistranslation. King James renders it, she shall be scourged. The literal Hebrew is, there shall be a scourging. It doesn't say that she was to be scourged. Actually, in this case, the master was to be scourged. There will be a scourging. They won't be put to death because she wasn't free. She was a servant and was not in a position to resist, but he will be scourged from it and has to bring a trespass offering. So he's, in that sense, publicly humiliated of having to come, make a public confession, and do all of this. And an atonement has to be made. We'll cover this when we come to tithing. This has to do with the fruit trees. When a tree is planted, this is speaking of a new seedling, that the first 3 years no fruit is to be collected or eaten, and the fourth year of the tree, the fruit goes to God, and from then on, the fruit is yours. So that's basically the principle there with fruit. Not to use enchantment or observe time, not to round the corners of your head, neither mar the corners of your beard. This is basically speaking of following the pagan fads and customs that were common among the Egyptians that generally had sort of a pagan overtone of the way they were doing that. The tattoos, verse 28. All of these principles, again, civil statutes in that way, but based on God's various principles of the law. Verse 31, not to regard them that have familiar spirits, wizards. Show respect to those who are older. Verse 32, don't vex the stranger. You're to love him as yourself. Verse 34, do no unrighteousness in judgment, in weight or measure or meat yard, just balances, just weights. This is what you are to do. So, again, we see that all of these things God has made a distinction. Chapter 25 of Leviticus goes into, we already looked at chapter 24 a little bit in terms of crime and punishment. Chapter 25 deals with finance and economics. We have the sabbatical year, the year of release. We've already seen some of this. The Jubilee this was the 50th year. Jubilee allowed every man, in verse 13 of chapter 25, to return to his possession. What you find is that agricultural land was divided up as a permanent inheritance to families. This chapter 25 is really a fundamental statute in terms of the economic structure of the nation. With the laws that God gave them, you could not have some of the problems that have tended to exist in our nations of the great disparity that tends to eventually produce it to arise between the very rich and the very poor. So you have a great landless masses in the cities who are just trouble waiting to happen. See, that's part of the problem with a lot of our cities. People are crowded in there. They're unskilled. They're off the land. They're there, and it just is trouble waiting to happen. It's an interesting parallel that if you'll trace it back, and there's clear enough history to run it back at least to the 17th century, you can find a boom and bust cycle of approximately every 50 years. Sometimes 45 years, sometimes 55 or 60, but basically on an average of just about 50 years on the button, going all the way back from the 1600s. You can look. We think of the Depression of the 1930s, and that happened in this country. But if you go back to the period right after the Reconstruction in the 1870s and 1880s, you find that there was a massive crash in this country. Go back and read about that in the latter part of the 1870s. You find back in the 1830s. You can go back to the 1780s. You can go back to the 1730s. You can go back to the 1680s. You can track it down and notice the specific things that have occurred. What you're looking at is approximately every generation. 50 years is long enough for people to forget the lessons their grandparents learned. And that's part of the mess we're in economically today. People, you got a generation in charge that has forgotten all the lessons that the grandparents learned as a result of having gone through the depression, the earlier depression in this century. And God had a system structured to where, in effect, you could lease land. Well, what it amounted to was you couldn't impoverish your family for generations to come. You could make a mess out of it, but the next generation got a chance for a fresh start. You could sell it, but the sale price was computed on the fact of how many years you'd get to use it before it reverted back to the family. And so every 50 years, people got a fresh start. It was not a total redistribution of wealth, but it was a redistribution of the land. God said the land belongs to me and I'm giving it to the families. We've operated in this country and many others, the land belongs to the government. And they will tax you on it, and if they want to expropriate it, they'll do that, and all of this. The government has put itself in the place of God, and this was not the system. You think you own your land, just don't pay taxes on it for a while and see who has title to it. There was no property tax in ancient Israel. There was no property tax. There was no inheritance tax. There was a tax on what was produced. It was a tax. You paid the tithe based on the increase, but you didn't pay tax just because the land was there. The basic principle of economics, verse 17 of Leviticus 25, you shall not therefore oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the eternal your God. Now that's the basic principle of economics. Don't oppress one another. And if people don't have a heart to obey that, then no amount of economic regulation is going to solve the problem if people are out trying to oppress each other. And the sabbatical year and the Jubilee cycle were tied together. It was that, as it says in verse 23, the land shall not be sold forever, the land is mine. You're strangers and sojourners with me. And all the land of your possession you shall grant a redemption for the land. So, it involved, this sort of a principle, you see, of servitude, of selling the land, of all these sorts of things. And the fact that family members could and should redeem one another, if possible. Leviticus 25, the kinsman redeemer. Verse 48, after that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. It's interesting. You see, ultimately, Jesus Christ was the kinsman redeemer. He was the one who gave himself to redeem all of us. This was a principle, though, in ancient Israel, that you ought to love your brother enough that you would seek to redeem him if he was sold into servitude or something of that sort. But all right, we'll go into some of the laws of tithing in a separate study because there's so much involved in that. Let's go on over to the book of Deuteronomy. And we will come back here, and the beginnings of Deuteronomy restate the Ten Commandments and the things of this nature, and sort of recap the history of what Israel had gone through up until then. And then on through chapter 14, which deals with clean and unclean meats, and with some information on tithing. And chapter 15, again, economic principles. At the end of every 7 years, you're to make a release. This is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lends aught to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother. It's called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner you may exact it again, but that which is yours with your brother, your hand shall release, save when there be no poor among you. This is for the purpose of there not being any poor. Somebody, if you loaned you loan someone some money, and he's trying to pay you at the sabbatical year, there was a release, and the debts were released in that way. So it was you didn't have a permanent debtor class. People, you were to help those who were in need. We're told, verse 11, the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command you, you open your hand wide unto your brother, to your poor, to your needy in your land. Your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto you, serve 6 years. In the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you send him out free from you, you shall not send him away empty. You provide for it. See, that he can go out and get a fresh start. If he wants to stay, then he can do that. Details are given there to regulate that. Chapter 17 deals with a little more in terms of punishment. It has to do with in verse 6, that the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. The mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. So capital crime, person was not to be convicted of a capital crime, was not to be executed unless it were absolutely proven. 2 or 3 witnesses. And the priests and the Levites were to diligently inquire, verse 9, and show you the sentence of the judgment. Verse 12, somebody will do presumptuously and won't listen. They are to be put to death. That's a capital crime. They're just incorrigible. Then it goes into the matter of a king in verse 14. The king was regulated here. We see that the monarchy of Israel, the government of Israel, was a constitutional government. The king was subject to the law, and that he was to himself read the law and to make his own copy. Some of the things having to do with the Levites here in chapter 18, the fact that they had no inheritance. We'll go into some of that a little later on in the subsequent study. The chapter 19 has to do with the cities of refuge. This was a matter of crime and punishment. Today, if somebody is incarcerated, they're put in jail. And they're separated from their family and they're a burden to the state. Well, in ancient Israel, you had 3 basic means of punishment. There were capital crimes. The individual was executed. It took 2 or 3 witnesses to convict them of a capital crime. If it was not a capital crime, it was a crime against property. It wasn't a capital crime, then restitution had to be made. A fine was levied, restitution was made. And the person had to pay it, or they were sold into servitude, sold into slavery, to work the debt off. Or if it were what we would term, if it were a capital crime, then restitution had to be made. A fine was levied, restitution was made. And the person had to pay it, or they were sold into servitude, sold into slavery, to work the debt off. Or if it were what we would term, if it were a capital crime, then restitution had to be made. A fine was levied, restitution was made. And the person had to pay it, or they were sold into servitude, sold into slavery, to work the debt off. Or if it were manslaughter, they, let's say they got in a fight and one of them was accidentally killed, then the person who had, or there was some sort of an accident, you see, today a person would be sent to jail for a period of time. There, he had to flee to the city of refuge. He fled to the city of refuge, and he had to remain there, and his family could remain with him, and he could be productive, but he was confined to the city of refuge, one of several designated places in the land that were administered by the Levites. And he had to live there until the death of the high priest, and he had to stay within the walled city. If he came out of it, one of the family members of the person who had been killed could legally take him to execute him. So it was a matter of preventing blood feuds from breaking out, and some long drawn-out thing that dragged on for generations, like the Hatfields and the McCoys and some of that sort of thing that has so often plagued various societies and cultures. But it didn't create a prison system. The prison system has just bred all sorts of problems. That's not the solution. The person had to make restitution if they were confined to a city of refuge, or if it was a capital crime such as murder, rape, or kidnapping. Those were basically the capital crimes: murder, rape, kidnap, or direct violation of some of the first four commandments, of where a person was guilty of idolatry or something of that nature. Chapter 20, Israel was involved in warfare as a carnal nation. So God knew they would. He says, when you go out to battle against your enemy and see horses and chariots and a people more than you, don't be afraid. God is with you. When you come near to battle, the priest shall approach and speak to the people. He shall say, Hear, O Israel, you approach this day unto battle against your enemies. Let not your hearts faint, fear not, do not tremble, neither be terrified because of them. The Lord God is he that goes with you to fight for you against your enemies. The officer shall speak unto the people and say, Who's built a new house and hasn't dedicated it? You can go and return, be excused from military service. You planted a vineyard and haven't eaten of it. You can go and return. If you have taken a wife and haven't, you can return. You're engaged to be married. You can go and return from the battle. Then verse 8, they said, Who's fearful and faint-hearted? Let him return to his house. You're just going to be a bad influence on everybody else. They did that at the Alamo, drew the line and said, asked them that. There was one man that left. One man decided that he fit this category. He didn't want to stay and die, so he left, and they let him leave. And the rest of them made their decision. Well, they were prepared to die. Number one, it's interesting. You know what they had? He goes through this, and then verse 10, when you come there, so there were exemptions to service. And then it comes down that in verse 10, when you come near unto a city to fight against it, you proclaim peace to it. Give them a chance to surrender. And if they make you an answer of peace and open unto you, it'll be that the people that is found therein shall be tributaries and serve you. If it won't make peace with you, but will make war, then you besiege it. And when God has delivered it to you, if they won't surrender, then the men were to be executed, but the women and the children were to be taken as spoil. And the cities right around there of the Canaanites were to be utterly destroyed. God did not want them intermingling with them because of the abominations. And they were not to denude the forests, and particularly the fruit trees and things of that sort, verse 19, during any of these times. Chapter 21 dealt with the matter of unsolved murders, and the way that this was to be gone through in terms of how the priests were to deal with it, and the elders of the city. Verses 15 and 16 deal with inheritance. Verse 15 says, if a man have two wives or have had two wives, this is the literal Hebrew, he's been married twice, and he loved one wife and didn't love the other, and he's had children by both of them. And this has to do with inheritance, you see. When the time comes for his sons to inherit, he can't disinherit the oldest son that was maybe, if he was married to a wife and then he's later married another wife and he likes the second wife better, or she's alive and there to influence him. He's not to, can't disinherit the other children. He's got to be fair in the inheritance. And the one that has the right of the firstborn is to be acknowledged in that way. In verse 22, if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, he's to be put to death. He's to be hung on a tree. He's not to remain all night, but he's to be taken down and buried. Chapter 22 goes into various things, taking care of one another's property. Verse 5, a woman not to wear what pertains to a man not to put on a woman's garment. This is, again, talking of a confusion of the senses. This is really, in one sense, ties into the principle of God's spiritual law. The commandment on adultery, the positive part of that has to do with family. And it has to do with male and female. Anything that confuses that, whether it's homosexuality, whether it's adultery, whether it's general immorality, is wrong. And it comes right on down even to the point that God did not want people cross-dressing in that way. He wanted women to present themselves in a way that was properly feminine, and men to present themselves in a way that was properly masculine. You look at some of the things, look at some of the fashion industry, look at some of just the bizarre things that come out. It's like they want to just erase the distinctions between the sexes. And it's incredible. I've been amazed of recent date, some of the bizarre haircuts that I have seen on women in public places. And it just, I've seen them with flat tops and crew cuts and things that were just, you would wonder, I would have thought that if I'd been a woman, I think I'd have sued whoever did that to me, but evidently they paid money to have it done. It's just crazy stuff that goes on. It's incredible. You could get, I don't think there's any limit to the fads that could be started. You could find somebody that would follow. Well, I think we'll go into this, maybe tie it in with some other things a little bit later, but you can tie it in back in the New Testament, Sometimes it has to do with clothing style. Sometimes it has to do with hair, like it mentions back in 1 Corinthians 11. Basically, the principle is there are different styles over a period of years and centuries. God didn't spell out one style forever, but He said there ought to be. There are certain things that are distinctly masculine. There are certain things that are distinctly feminine. And there should not be a confusion of the two, where you can't tell who's who and what's what. God's not the author of confusion. So when you have confusion, you figure somebody else is the author of it. It comes on down in chapter 22, talks the regulations in terms of divorce are given. Accusations that were made about a woman in retrospect, all of these sorts of things are spelled out. That is not not to be not to be done. And we find here on down verse 22, it has to do with basically rape, spelling out the difference between rape and adultery. In the case of adultery, where both of them were executed. In the case of rape, where of course the man who did it was executed. And verse 25 talks about if a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man force her and lie with her, the man only that lay with her shall die. to the damsel, you do nothing. You know, there's nothing, no sin worthy of death. It's like a man rising up against his neighbor and killing him. You know, that's the same thing. It's not, she hasn't committed some sin. So it describes here, you know, a situation where she was out in the field and she couldn't, she cried out, but there wasn't anybody to save her. So the man is taken and executed. In verse 24 describes a different situation. You know, they were in the city. They were in a place where she could have gotten help. She didn't resist. She didn't cry out. She didn't do anything to do that. So she acquiesced to it. That's not. There's a lot of confusion today in terms of American civil law. A lot of confusion in the courts about what constitutes rape and all of this. You know, sometimes somebody changes their mind 2 or 3 days later, and then they want to turn around and sue for what happened earlier. Well, basically, the principle is here that the principle is that the innocent party is expected to put up some resistance, and if it occurred off in a remote area, then obviously, you know, her resistance or her the presumption is in her favor that she had tried to resist, and there was nobody to help her out. So gets into certain things coming on down, laws of uncleanness, which we have gone into earlier. And chapter 24 deals with some of the principles of divorce. Down in verse 6 it says, talks about a pledge. You're not to take millstone. You know, people ground their grain day by day. They didn't have storage facilities for flour. You know what happens to flour, and if you just have it out open at room temperature, it doesn't take too long to breed, you know, weevils to get in and problems to come. So they because they didn't have refrigeration, this was pretty important. You know, so somebody borrowed money. You weren't to take something that the person couldn't do without as a pledge. You weren't to be hard-hearted in that way. And verse 16 of chapter 24, the father shall not be put to death for the children, neither the children for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. You're not to pervert the judgment of the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. Take a widow's raiment to pledge. And chapter 25, you know, there's recently been a big flap over caning and over in Singapore. Well, chapter 25, if there be a controversy between men, they come unto judgment, and the judges shall judge them. They will justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. If the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten before his face according to his fault by a certain number. And he could be given up to 40 stripes, but it's not to exceed that. That's why the Jews normally gave as the maximum penalty 40 stripes save one. Or as they give 39, in case somehow they miscounted, they wouldn't go over 40. This was their idea. But he's not to, in any case, regardless of what the crime is, he's not to be given more than that. But here were, you know, certain crimes. A person was taken out and was given a beating, you know, or given stripes, I should say, maybe rather than a beating. It was not. This was not the Roman cat of nine tails, but it was the use of like a leather strap, and they just took him out and gave him a good whipping. And you know that. I tell you, there are a lot of problems, a lot of young folks that would really be straightened out if somebody just really gave them a good whipping, and they didn't need to be locked up for 6 months. They didn't need to be a whole lot of things. They were given what they needed and a stern lecture and sent on their way. And if they'd done damage, they had to make restitution. And I'll guarantee you, all Israel hear and fear. You know, it works. I bet you're not going to see that young fella going back over to Singapore and spray painting any more cars. He sort of made a believer out of him. Some of these things may seem a little harsh, but I'll tell you, if you're on the receiving end of crime, you realize that's even more harsh, because then the innocent suffers. Under God's system, it was the guilty that suffered. And sometimes people feel sorry for the poor guy that was guilty. Well, there ought to be a little more sympathy for the poor person that was innocent, that was minding his own business and had his property vandalized or his livestock stolen or whatever it was. The matters of law and inheritance, verse 13, you're not to have in your bag different weights, a great and a small. This was a trick. You know how they weighed back in ancient times? They used a balance and they used weights. And people think of all sorts of things. They'd have a weight and they would shave off a little bit to where it would read one weight, but it'd be a little bit light. It's sort of like recalibrating the scales. Or the old deal about the butcher, putting his thumb on the scales when he weighed out the meat. That sort of a principle. That's just God had to spell things out. You know why? Because if he left something out, people would figure, there's no law against that, so I guess I can do that. We won't go into the first fruits part of it. Well, I think that pretty well looks at it. What we find is we could have gone also. We find in Exodus 18 the rulers of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. The structure of government, that there was structure. It was constitutional government. It was based on the law. There were cities of refuge. 6 cities of refuge is spelled out in Deuteronomy 19. There were compensation for damages. There was things that were involved, and it all gets back to the fact that the people of God, the children of Israel, were to be a peculiar people. They were the people of God. And it was to be reflected in the whole variety of the way that they lived. So when you go through the statutes and the judgments, we find that there are principles that pretty well apply all the way through. There are specifics that apply to that specific time and circumstance that were that related to the nation, that related to inheritance and to property boundaries and things of that sort. But the principles, ultimately, even of the civil statutes, are based on the fact of properly treating your neighbor. And while we're not out executing punishments on people for the violation of law, we're not administering the administration of death in the New Testament. The time is going to come when we will once again be dealing with nations. Be dealing with nations. And their strong nations afar off will have to be reviewed and made to beat their sword into plowshares and not to learn war anymore. That time is going to come. And as we look here at the rules that God gave Israel for functioning as a civil nation, we can certainly think about the fact that we as a nation would be a whole lot better off if we applied some of these statutes and judgments rather than the latest things that Congress has passed and the Supreme Court has come up with. So with that, we'll be concluded this evening, and we will go further next time.